Welcome back to Screen Crush. I'm Ryan Airy, and this is all of the Easter eggs, references, and little things that you might have missed in Thor: Love and Thunder. Now we're going to break down this movie for you. Not just all the connections to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but also its themes, its nods to the comics, and some wild speculation on where the MCU is headed. So let us begin. We open on the sands of a distant alien world with Gorr, he who will be known as the God Butcher. Gorr's origin here is mostly taken from the comics, where he was a very devout man whose gods ignored his prayers and his family died. But the comics have a slightly more supernatural view of gods. For instance, at the beginning of the God Butcher storyline, a little girl on a desert world prays to Thor for rain, and he hears her prayers and answers. And there are other nods to that moment that I'll talk about just a little bit later in the video. Now, one thing that's important about this opening is that Gorr does not pray for his own life. As a follower, he expects to be sacrificed to his gods, but he does pray for the life of his daughter. This foreshadows the end of the movie when he surrenders his quest to bring her back to life. Spoilers, I guess. I mean, if you made it this far, I assumed you'd be okay with spoilers. Anyways, I love that the movie started with the death of a child because, I mean, after that happens, it's like anything goes, right? They broke the one rule. Kids don't die! Afterwards, the Necro Sword calls out to Gorr. Now, this sword is slightly different from how it appeared in the comics. There, it was more of a shapeless goo that Gorr could manipulate because it was created by Null, the god of the symbionts. But everything related to the symbionts is off limits for Marvel Studios because Sony owns the film rights to all those characters. And thank goodness too, because otherwise we would never get awesome content like this. Have sex, excel. Now, we're going to do a whole video about the Necro Sword, where it came from, wildly speculating about how it'll fit into the MCU. This movie does tell us that it's been around since the dawn of time, kind of like the Infinity Stones.
Big Bang sends 6 elemental crystals hurtling across the virgin universe.
Perhaps it even existed before this universe, like Galactus. Maybe it was even used by a God Butcher to chop the head off a Celestial, creating Nowhere. And maybe the Necro Sword orphaned little baby Ego. But what I thought was most interesting about this sword is the way it kind of moves, and it called out to Gorr, much like the Ebony Blade called out to Dane Whitman in the Eternals. And both swords kind of have this black ooze to them. Now, the Eternals kind of glossed over this point, but the Ebony Blade is a very ancient cosmic artifact that could be like a cousin to the Necro Sword. In the comics, Merlin forged the Ebony Blade from a meteor and then gave it to Dane's ancestor. Then each generation passed it on, becoming the Black Knight. But the blade actually corrupted people and slowly brought out the worst in them. This is very much like the Necro Sword. They are both weapons that crave death, ooze with a black liquid, and corrupt the people who use them. It is possible that the Ebony Blade and the Necro Sword were forged from the same primordial substance, and that they serve the same Dark Master, a Dark Master who wants all gods to be killed. And of course, I'm talking about
Mephisto!
Not the beast! Or Dracula, or whoever else Blade's going to fight in the Midnight Suns movie. So, Gorr stumbles onto an oasis in the desert where his god, Rapu, is wasting resources and having a great time, ignoring the prayers of his people. Rapu is played by Jonathan Brew, who was in What We Do in the Shadows alongside writer, director, visionary, plus actor Taika Waititi. You know, even though Gorr the God Butcher has relatable motives and everything, you can still tell he's a bad guy from a mile away. How? Well, he's bald. You ever notice that? A lot of the MCU bad guys are bald. Someone really should have told Gorr that the best way to prevent hair loss is to start when you still have hair left. And that is why I use Keeps. They're the sponsor of this week's video. There's a history of hair loss in my family, so when my hair started to thin, I didn't waste any time. Treatments can take up to 4 to 6 months or more to see results, so it is important that you act fast, and you have to start early and stick with it. So believe me, if your hair's starting to thin, don't put it off. Start using Keeps now. The sooner you start using Keeps, the more hair you'll save. It's even proven to work on a God Butcher scalp. Keeps has more 5-star reviews than any of their competitors, and that is why hundreds of thousands of men trust Keeps for their hair loss prevention medication. So if you're noticing that you're losing your hair, don't ignore it or hope it'll go away. Do something about it. For a limited time, go to keeps.com/screencrush or click the link in the description to get 50% off your first order. Back to the Easter eggs. Gorr's god is shown as having a long beard and a headdress that seems like light, emanating from his head. Now, this is in keeping with traditional depictions of gods on Earth. Michelangelo drew God as a wise old man with a beard, and Zeus was always depicted this way as well. And in both Eastern and Western religions, light emanating from the head is a sign of divinity. So, for a moment, I want to talk about the subtext of this movie. Taika Waititi's Thor Ragnarok is my favorite MCU movie because it's disguised as a quirky comedy, but it's actually about the dangers of colonialism and nationalism. Made a whole video about that we are all very proud of. This movie was about how the ultra-wealthy rich exploit the working classes. It's easy to look at Gorr and see a parallel with Karl Marx, the German philosopher whose ideas would become the foundation for communism. them. Marx had 4 children die of malnutrition, and he resented the great wealth that was hoarded by the upper classes. In the same way, we see the gods in Love and Thunder feed off the praise of mortals, but then take them for granted. While they have gold blood in their veins, they're refusing to answer the prayers of people like Jane, who has to fill her veins with poison just to try to stay alive. Anyways, we're going to talk about all the subtext and symbolism in our What's the Point video in just a few days. Be patient with us, it's going to be a good one. So, Gorr's god mocks him, and if you notice, most of the gods in the movie have this gold blood. This fits in neatly with the metaphor of gods hoarding wealth, that they are so wealthy that they literally have money running through their veins. But also, it separates these gods from the kind gods like Thor, who has literally bled red blood in battle besides mortals. Then we go to the Marvel logo with the studio's theme played on an electric guitar to show that this movie is going to be a little more metal than anything we've seen in the past. Then we see Gorr telling the story to a group of children. Now, this is important for a few reasons. One, this is how myths like Thor were originally created in real life. Wise old men in caves whispering stories to children about the gods and heroes. In many ways, this is what all of us are still doing right now, except instead of caves, we go to the movies to hear these stories. And it's also clever because Korg is voiced by director Taika Waititi. So, by narrating this story to the kids, he's also telling the story to us, the audience. This also reminds me a lot of the 5th Planet of the Apes movie, Battle for Planet of the Apes, which revealed that the entire ape saga was actually a John Huston ape talking to a mix of ape and human youngsters. And, you know, with all the bad reboots coming out, where's my next Apes movie? That trilogy was really good. And by the way, we have a huge announcement we're really excited about coming out 1 week from today on July 15th. So make sure you follow me on Twitter and subscribe and smash that bell for alerts so you don't miss this news. It's going to be really big. Anyways, when Korg begins telling the story, he calls Jane Fonda, the Academy Award-winning actress, and later he calls her Jodie Foster. And of course, here's a picture of Jodie Foster holding a lamb. I forget what movie that's from. Next, we see a montage of Thor's life set to Enya's Only Time. Now, this song is about surrendering your life to the inevitability of time. There's no point in worrying about your path or your road because time is going to reveal this to you. And this is the mindset that Thor has at the start of the movie. He is sitting back and letting the universe guide his path. There's also a parallel here with Jane, who refuses to let the universe guide her path, and Darcy has to literally tell her, you should listen to what the universe is trying to tell you to do. And this also fits in with the movie's themes of godhood and divinity, that mortal people should trust in the will of the gods or the universe instead of trying to control everything around them. So in the montage, we see young Frigga taking baby Thor into battle, and this young version of him running is Tristan Hemsworth, son of Chris Hemsworth. And the teenage version of Thor is wearing a comic-accurate costume from the original Kirby-era run. It's interesting that we also saw old Loki dressed in a comic-accurate costume in the show Loki. Maybe he decided to wear the same clothes that he wore as a teenager while he was hiding out from the rest of the universe.
After I faked my death, I simply drifted in space. Away from Thor, away from everything.
Then we see various Thor romances, including a pirate woman beside a dead Kraken, and then a montage of his dead family.
That's rough, buddy.
But the best part of this montage is when Korg shows us the deaths of the Warriors 3, and he just says that one, and that one. This is making fun of how quickly Taika Waititi had them dispatched by Hela and Thor Ragnarok, which upset some fans, but only like 5 of them. And now all 5 of you are going to blast me on Twitter with like 100 different accounts each. Then we see Thor getting in shape, going from his Endgame body and Viking beard suit. He's wearing a trucker hat with an old school Avengers logo and the names of the team members, but he's crossed off mightiest to write strongest, a callback to this.
Strongest Avenger.
Access denied.
Strongest Avenger.
Access denied.
And then he decides to meditate on a mountain, waiting there until someone needs him. This is very godlike behavior. Zeus stays on Mount Olympus above the clouds. Many gods won't interfere in mortal affairs until the mortals pray to them for help. So Thor's character arc in this movie is about learning to be a better god. He starts off kind of careless, not helping until he's begged, and then he wrecks the alien temple. But by the end of the movie, he's learned to empathize with mortals like Gorr, and even promises to raise a mortal child as his own.
Well, she's not really mortal anymore.
Yeah, I know, more on that in a bit. When Thor gets up, we can see that Stormbreaker has grown roots, which is interesting. Remember that Stormbreaker's handle was created from Groot's arm. And a lot of people have asked me if this means that Stormbreaker could grow into a Groot, like the sprig that was salvaged from the Milano in Guardians 1. Now, I personally don't think that this handle could grow fully sentient, but it definitely behaves instinctually like an organism, like how a worm will still wriggle if it's cut in two.
But the hammer has feelings. We see that later on. It gets jealous and stuff.
Yes, but Stormbreaker's feelings don't seem to come from the handle. They come from the enchanted hammer. Or maybe it's a combination of the two. Anyways, the hammer's being sentient is largely symbolic anyways.
Symbolic of what?
Well, in the last movie, Thor learned that he didn't need a weapon at all. The weapon was just a conduit for his power.
That hammer was to help you control your power, to focus it. It's never your source of strength.
But in this movie, both Thor and Jane use the hammers as a conduit for their emotions. They're pretty closed off from one another, but their hammers allow them to show how they're actually feeling. Thor is jealous of Jane holding Mjolnir, so Stormbreaker expresses that jealousy for him, in a narrative sense. Anyways, back on the mountain, Thor rides Stormbreaker like a witch's broom, calling back to this joke from Ragnarok.
You rode a hammer.
No, I didn't ride the hammer.
The hammer rode you on your back.
And hey, the next time someone tells you the Marvel movies are all the same, remember that you saw a space Viking fight a bunch of owl people riding Mad Max jet scooters to Welcome to the Jungle by Guns N' Roses.
That was awesome.
And Thor's outfit here is filled with Easter eggs. He's wearing comic-accurate boots from the Silver Age era, the vest looks like it was cut from a Ravager outfit that he took from Quill, and his shirt shows Yggdrasil, the world tree, in front of a Bifrost. And of course, Thor having a Bifrost on his chest at the start of the movie foreshadows the ending, when a Statue of Eternity has a Bifrost symbol on its chest that opens the gateway to the center of the universe. And his entire costume is modeled after the Thor spin-off hero Thunderstrike from the 90s comics. King Yakan tells Thor that none of their gods are answering their prayers, and this is how the Gorr the God Butcher story begins in the comics. A little alien girl prays for rain, and Thor answers her prayers. Then he goes to investigate and finds out the other gods didn't answer her prayers because they had been slaughtered. In fact, this panel is replicated as one of the distress signals that the Guardians intercept. So Thor springs into action, and by the way, I also think his muscle shirt was inspired by Kurt Russell's character in Big Trouble in Little China. Then he proceeds to decimate the owl people, even stopping along the way to do some Jean-Claude Van Damme splits between two bikes. And then we go from Thor, a god answering the prayers of mortals, to Jane, a mortal who needs her prayers answered by a god. Or put another way, we go from Thor destroying a temple to Cancer destroying the temple of Jane's body. Now, just like in the Mighty Thor comics, Jane is suffering from cancer. The movie implies this is a hereditary condition because she watched her mother suffer from it. But I'm also wondering if it could have been caused by the residual effects of having the ether in her body in Thor the Dark World. She's getting chemo next to a guy who's reading her book on wormholes called The Foster Theory. Now, this is actually the first time we've seen Natalie Portman play Jane with new footage since 2013.
But wait, she was in Avengers Endgame.
She was, but that was actually unused footage from Thor the Dark World that they repurposed for that movie. Now, even though we haven't seen her since 2013, we have heard that her career as a scientist is really taking off.
There's even talk of Jane getting a Nobel Prize.
So when she's explaining wormholes, she uses the cliche of folding a piece of paper in half and then using a pen to poke through them. But the best part of this is that the movie acknowledges this cliche when she references two movies that have done this in the past, Event Horizon and Interstellar.
It folds space so that point A and point B coexist in the same space and time.
Wormhole bends space like this, so you can take a shortcut through a higher dimension.
Now Darcy is with her. It's the first time we've seen her since WandaVision.
Have fun in prison!
And Darcy tells her to take it easy, to quote, listen to what the universe is trying to tell you, which is another way of saying allow yourself to be guided by a celestial power or God. Very similar to how Thor was meditating and waiting for the universe to guide his next path. Jane doesn't want to seek help from Thor or any Asgardian tech, and this is also taken from the comics. When she has cancer, she tells Thor that she doesn't want to get wrapped up in any Asgardian spells because there's always a price or a complication.
Then why does she pick up the hammer and become Thor?
Well, because in the comics and in the movie, being a Thor allows her to help people, to give the final days of her life some meaning.
Okay then.
But she is seeking the help from Dr. Eric Selvig, who is also having a career renaissance. He appeared in a Nova-type documentary, Seen in Far From Home, and his name is getting thrown around by junior scientists.
I think it's by Dr. Eric Selvig.
But then Jane sees a book on Viking myths, and it has Yggdrasil, the world tree, on its spine, and the hammer begins to call to her through this book. And there is a parallel here with Gorr, who also answered the call of a weapon, the Necrosword. Both the Necrosword and Mjolnir kind of end up infecting their users. The sword corrupts Gorr to obey his worst impulses, while Mjolnir prevents Jane from being able to heal her cancer. And then GNR's Sweet Child of Mine starts to play as we go to the new Asgard, as we open on the same sign that we saw in Avengers Endgame. So this is Tonsberg in Norway, which we have seen in the MCU in the past, and it was in the opening of Thor the Dark World and the Red Skull's first scene in Captain America First Avenger. And this is where the Asgardians relocated after Ragnarok. Now, when Thor was king of New Asgard, the community was a poor fishing village. Under Valkyrie's leadership, it has flourished as a tourist destination. This is also a meta-commentary on the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. As Marvel movies have gained millions of fans, the Marvel heroes in the movies are also celebrities with millions of fans. A few things to notice from around the city. We see the Asgardians Asgardian tour cruise ships painted with the colors of the Bifrost, because they're a gateway to New Asgard. And the concept of Asgardians using their celebrity to become wealthy on Earth was actually hinted at way back in the brilliant Thor's Roommate shorts made for the Thor Ragnarok DVD. These shorts showed us that during Captain America Civil War, Thor was living with an Australian guy named Daryl, and he tried to cash in on his celebrity to make rent.
I'm a celebrity that will sell like hotcakes.
And there's other nods to these shorts that make them canon that I'm going to go over a little bit later. So the rooftops of New Asgard are beginning to be capped with gold, a symbol that the kingdom is regaining its former glory, and maybe on its way to making the same mistakes. There are also 2 streets in the city named after prominent Thor writers. We have Simonson Street after Walt Simonson, and Aaron Avenue after Jason Aaron, who wrote the original Gorr the God Butcher and Jane Mighty Thor storylines. There are also lots of aliens living in New Asgard, just as Korg predicted.
It will become a haven for all peoples and aliens of the universe.
Also, in one of these opening shots, we see the son of Heimdall, Astrid, wearing a GNR shirt from the album Use Your Illusion, which featured November Rain, a song in this movie that I'm going to talk about later on. And Valkyrie has become something of a celebrity herself, filming an Old Spice commercial, probably like this one.
Look again. The tickets are now diamond.
Meek has become her right-knifed bug.
This is my very good friend over here, Meek. He's an insect and has knives for hands.
And we see Meek using those knife hands to cut the ribbon on a new ice cream parlor called Infinity Cones, written with the same font as the Infinity War movie logo. And then we go to the outdoor drama depicting the events of Thor Ragnarok, like the play that was in Ragnarok depicting Thor the Dark World. Sam Neill, Liam Hemsworth, and Matt Damon all return to reenact the scene where Hela breaks Thor's hammer, which is a neat way to remind the civilians in the audience exactly why Thor doesn't have his original hammer right now, in case you're not the type of person who's like up on every single movie. But this time, Melissa McCarthy joins the cast as Hela, and my favorite part of this was how low rent the effects were. Taika Waititi has a background in theater, and you can see him having fun with all the limits of stage production in this scene. And we also get a reproduction of Odin turning into Valhalla dust, a way to foreshadow Jane's fate at the end of the movie. Also in the play, Thor is holding an umbrella during Odin's death scene, just like he was in Ragnarok, where Mjolnir was disguised as an umbrella, just like it was in the original comics when his first identity was an Earthman named Donald Blake. Also, there is one kid in the crowd who is wearing Thor's gladiator wing helmet from Ragnarok, a real toy that you can purchase. Liam Hemsworth also mispronounces the name of the hammer, just like Darcy always did.
Mjolnir? What's Mjolnir? Mjolnir!
And then we go to the actual hammer, which has not been moved since it struck the Earth. Not to brag, but I predicted this plot point all the way back when they first announced the movie. I get most things wrong, but I got this one right, and I want to be acknowledged for it.
Wow, good job.
Thor's former roommate Daryl is the tour guide who shows Jane the pieces, hashtag make Daryl canon achieved. This scene is also very similar to the comics when Mjolnir calls out to Jane. In the comics, Mjolnir is actually possessed by a sentient storm called the God Tempest. Now in this movie, it's presented more like a loyal pet that's a proxy for Thor's emotions. Though in the comics, after the hammer was reformed, it did gain full sentience and became the god of hammers. It's a long story. Also, just like in the comics, Jane keeps her face hidden when she approaches the hammer. Though in the books, this was to preserve the twist that she was the new Thor. Back in space, King Yakan calls Thor the god of destruction after he destroyed their temple. Now this is nicely setting up Thor's arc in the movie, where he goes from being a carefree god to one who actually inspires and answers prayers. Then they give Thor the screaming goats, which I think was actually a way of punishing him without like him realizing it was punishment. Now in mythology, Thor actually traveled using a chariot pulled by 2 goats named Teeth Thin and Teeth Grinder, very similar to Teeth Gnasher and Tooth Grinder in this movie. And their screams are a play on the famous Screaming Goats video.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
Sorry, I meant this one. And Kraglin gets married, which apparently he does on every planet the Guardians visit. I'm wondering if this plot point will get revisited in Guardians 3, or if it's just a way to write Kraglin out of the team for when that movie starts. So when they depart, Thor teaches Quill a handshake.
It's the Asgardian shake. Into the snake that you cannot trust.
And that last line, the snake you cannot trust, is another callback to Ragnarok, when Thor describes one of Loki's pranks.
He transformed himself into a snake, and he knows that I love snakes. So I went to pick up the snake to admire it, and he transformed back into himself, and he was like, yeah, it's me! And he stabbed me.
And then there's a bit of fun where Thor talks like the Guardians, our crew on his own ship, calling back to this last scene in Endgame.
Everybody knows who's in charge.
Then the distress calls come in from gods being slaughtered around the galaxy, including one from Jamie Alexander's Lady Sif. Now, Lady Sif did appear in the first 2 Thor movies, but she was spared Taika Waititi's slaughter of the Warriors 3 because she was filming a show called The Blind Spot. Now, Jamie Alexander does love playing this character, and she appeared in 2 episodes of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I'm really glad to see her back. Thor and Korg discover the corpse of Falagar the Terrible in a moment that was faithfully recreated from this panel in the comics. This was drawn by the great Asad Ribic, and I hope that he got some credit or a bonus for creating this image in a billion-dollar movie. Lady Sif loses an arm, which actually Thor did in this storyline in the comics, and he replaced it with one of the arms from the Destroyer robot that we saw in Thor 1. And in the movie, Lady Sif appears much more comic accurate, wearing red armor and pretty much the same helmet that she does in the books. Back on New Asgard, Thor is transformed into a suit that is more Viking-like, probably because he's traveling back home to his roots. Gorr shows up to attack and summons shadow creatures from the sword. Now, in the comics, this is a little bit different. The shadow creatures he creates from the sword are called Black Berserkers. Basically, semi-sentient monsters that he controls and are tied to the sword and are kind of like astral venom symbionts. They're not as closely linked to literal shadows. In Axel's room, we see a poster for Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction, that's their best album, and Valkyrie is in her pajamas wearing a shirt from Phantom of the Opera. Maybe the show toured to New Asgard, or maybe she's just a massive fan. You can also draw parallels to Phantom and Gorr. Phantom of the Opera is about a man who is horribly scarred, lives in an opera house, and is jealous of the people who work there.
That's an oversimplification, but okay.
Well, I don't want to describe the whole thing, I'm not Lindsay Ellis, but basically the Phantom is like Gorr in this movie. They both suffered a tragedy and want revenge, but the show ends with Phantom doing a face turn and saving his rival so he can live with his love, Christine. Gorr also spares Thor so he can raise his own daughter, Love. During the battle, we get our first look at Jane as the mighty Thor, and it is awesome! I love how comic accurate this suit is, right down to the mask. It also looks like Jane created a suit for herself that is much more in line with Thor's suit from the Dark World, the last time they were together. So she would have modeled the suit after that time period. And during the battle, Thor changes his armor to gold to impress her. Now this is modeled more after the Walt Simonson run of the books, when Thor was cursed with brittle bones and had to wear armor. This homage is probably why the filmmakers named a street in New Asgard after him. Then there's a sad little montage of Korg narrating their relationship. In this, we see him making pancakes for Jane, just like he does for Love at the end of the movie, and it turns out that Thor's description of the breakup was accurate.
This is a mutual dumping.
They were both scared of loss, so they retreated into their work. During the montage, Thor even gets a call from Nick Fury, another callback to those Daryl shorts.
And is Fury his real name, or is it actually pronounced Furry?
Now the Nick Fury joke is interesting because, consider this time period. This would have been a little before and after Age of Ultron, and in this time period, S.H.I.E.L.D. fell and Nick Fury went on the lam. Now it is possible that Fury was giving Thor assignments in between Winter Soldier and Age of Ultron when he was out looking for Hydra cells, but I doubt it. Remember, Thor ended Age of Ultron by going off to look for Infinity Stones, and now we know that Fury has been in space for a long time. Maybe even these 2 appearances were Skrulls. So what if Fury was actually in space sending Thor leads on where to find Infinity Stones?
Good theory.
Thanks. And it also explains how Talos knew that Thor was off-world here.
What about Thor?
Off-world.
Now during this montage, Korg mentions that space grew between Thor and Jane, which is literal because Thor actually went into space and left her behind. And this clip.
What's it been like? 3, 4 years?
8 years, 7 months, and 6 days, give or take.
First of all, it's sweet that Thor can remember these few years so well because he's 1,500 years old and a year is like nothing to him. But also, there's a 5-year discrepancy in those dates because Jane was blipped for 5 years. Now Gorr ends the fight on Asgard by taking away their children, which has many symbolic meanings.
There will be no young to take care of our old. Our old will feed off our very old.
When you take away children, you're essentially stealing the future. In stories like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, children are taken away as punishment for the adult's sins. And in the book of Exodus, the angel of death takes away the firstborn of every household in Egypt who didn't put lamb's blood over their doorway.
And that is the story of Passover.
That's right, Doug. And I'm pointing this out to show there's a lot of different aspects of like God and mythology wrapped up in the story of this movie. And actually, this plot point is very similar to the comics, where Gorr the God Butcher starts to enslave gods to create a god bomb, which will end all God's existence. Very similar to his goal in this movie. Then the Asgardians are thrown into a moment of crisis when the stage actors offer to immediately put on a show to ease the people's spirits. I thought this was pretty great because for one, that's typical of talent, always wanting all the focus on themselves. And 2, this debunks the really great theory that the actors in the stage play were the real Sam Neill, Matt Damon, and Liam Hemsworth, and Loki just hired them to put on this performance for him. Now during this scene, the people begin to grumble, and one of the Asgardians even says, "Half our soldiers are already dead." A callback to Thanos calling what was left of Asgard's military at the beginning of Infinity War. Then Thor communicates with Heimdall's son using that eye closing trick from Ragnarok.
Help me see.
Axel's ability kind of supports the theory that Odin imbued Heimdall with the spirit of the Soul Stone, and that energy was passed on to his heirs. Now during this scene, the kids surround Thor and beg for his aid, which has another religious parallel to Jesus being swarmed by the multitudes of lepers. The kids are trapped in the colorless shadow realm where all the saturation has been bled from the world. In other words, a Zack Snyder movie. Of course, a world with no color implies a world with no joy, symbolic of how joy has left the life of Gorr the God Butcher. It's also symbolic of a world without faith in beauty, or faith in a higher power, like the gods. This is why the energy of the gods still has color in this realm, because they represent hope for a better tomorrow. The Shadow Realm actually first appeared in Strange Tales number 79, and it was filled with these living shadows called the Ka. No relation. Meanwhile, Thor's new team takes a tourist cruise boat out on the Bifrost. The ship is called the Aegir, named after the Norse god of the sea. Now notice the Cocktails and Dreams sign here. That's the name of the bar that Tom Cruise starts at the end of the movie Cocktail.
That's a great movie. Tom Cruise flips bottles around and everything. Good soundtrack. Down to Kokomo.
Yeah, it is a good movie. Now moving on. They go to Omnipotent City.
We'll get there fast and then we'll take it slow.
You like doing a bit or something?
Where we wanna go.
Down
in Kokomo.
I gotta get out of here, man. So next they go to Omnipotent City, which is an endless city of gods from the comics. It was built by the Lords of the Dawn, the first Elder Gods. And we recently heard about another Elder God in the MCU back in Multiverse of Madness.
The first demon, Sir Thorn, carved his dark magic into this tomb.
Basically, the Elder Gods were the first gods to walk the surface of the earth before there were any other life forms. One of these, Chthon, was evil and filled the whole earth with demons like the ones we see in Multiverse of Madness. Then we go to the gods pre-show orgy, where we can see several gods from mythology. This looks like Bass, the panther god from Black Panther.
A warrior shaman received a vision from the panther goddess Bast, who led him to the heart-shaped herb.
We also saw Quetzalcoatl of the Aztecs, Dionysus, the son of Zeus, who says, "Way to go, Dad!" There's Artemis, another daughter of Zeus, and then there's Bao, the god of dumplings, probably a nod to this genius Pixar short. Korg's Cronin god is sitting on a throne of scissors, a joke about the Iron Throne in Game of Thrones, and a callback to this.
Made of rocks, as you can see, but don't let that intimidate you. You don't need to be afraid unless you're made of scissors. Just a little rock, paper, scissors joke for you.
There's also Zama the Mayan god and a Maori god, a nod to Taika Waititi's Maori heritage. And we also see the Egyptian sun god Ra, which makes me think, is this why the gods in Moon Knight couldn't help out with the Earthlings anymore? Did they abandon humanity so they could hang out in Omnipotent City and have an orgy? Around this time, Valkyrie mentions that Raven Mail is faster than email.
I was banished for not abandoning humanity unlike the rest of you.
Raven Mail is apparently the Asgardian messaging system named after Odin's two ravens, Hugin and Munnin. And Asgardians having disdain for email was first shown in those Daryl Store shorts that I mentioned earlier.
I don't have a phone.
He doesn't have a phone.
Send a raven.
And I loved Zeus, especially that Russell Crowe gave him an actual Greek accent, so he sounds like he's trying to send back soup in an Astorian deli. Thor is a massive fan of Zeus, but this encounter proves you should never meet your heroes, something that Gorr learned in the first scene when he met his favorite god. Again, drawing parallels between these two characters. Now, this scene with all the gods gathered together is also a reference to the pantheon of gods from the Thor comics. It's basically a council of the old gods like Odin and Zeus who make decisions together, the original Illuminati. Zeus rips away Thor's tunic and we see his new back tattoo, a tribute to his brother, with text that reads, "R.I.P. Loki, rest in mischief." Now this is around the time we learned that the heart of the universe is where eternity is located, and this is an interesting choice of words because there is a heart of the universe artifact in Marvel Comics. It's one of the weirdest, most powerful, enigmatic objects in the Marvel canon. It created the Infinity Gems, caused the universe to collapse and be reborn, and it's primarily known as the source of your mom. The Greek soldiers who serve Zeus have period-accurate shields, which you might recognize from the movie 300.
This is Spot!
Then Korg is shattered like the Cronin that Thor seemingly killed here. But apparently, Thor didn't kill the guy. Good to know in case he was Korg's cousin or something. Afterwards, Valkyrie ties him to the back of her head, kind of like Professor Quirrell, and her hair becomes his mustache. After the battle, they cruise past two Celestials. Now, Eric Voss at New Rockstars identified these as the Mad Celestial, and the one on the right is the Celestial Gardener. As Stormbreaker is working as a Bifrost, we get some pretty clear close-ups of the weapon, where we can clearly see the runes inscribed on it. The runes translate to Stormbreaker, Loose the Dogs of War, and Worthy Vengeance. Appropriate, since the hammer was created to exact vengeance on Thanos during the Infinity War. On the way to Gorr's Shadow World, they see some space dolphins. Very Lisa Frank, I had a Trapper Keeper just like that. And these are similar to the space sharks in the comics that Thor encounters along with his past and future selves. So during this trip, Korg tells the story of how he was conceived, foreshadowing that he'll meet a nice man and have his own kids by the end of the movie. And Valkyrie opens up about the woman that she loved, who Hela killed in Ragnarok's flashback. Everything in this movie always finds a way to relate back to love and relationships. Some people have lost love, others are looking for it. Even the feelings of the hammers are proxies for how Thor and Jane are feeling about each other. And then Korg expresses exactly how Valkyrie is feeling, breaking down every emotional beat of her story, kind of like he did for Thor missing his hammer in Ragnarok.
Sounds like you had a pretty special and intimate relationship with this hammer, and that losing it was almost comparable to losing a loved one.
So when Thor finally confesses his love to Jane, he says that he doesn't want to trust their future to fate, which shows some character growth for him. In the past, he always spoke like he believed he was always going to achieve greatness no matter what, because he was chosen by fate.
I'm only alive because fate wants me alive. Fate wills it so.
Put another way, Jane is now Thor because she's running away from her problems. But Thor is the one who's tired of running, so he is going toward Jane. In the Shadow Realm, Jane discovers that Gorr is after Stormbreaker so he can create a Bifrost. Now, in the past, we've theorized that Odin used the Space Stone to create the Bifrost. So it's appropriate that it takes the energy of a Space Stone to reach the center of the universe, where the Space Stone was created. In this realm, only magic retains color, similar to this effect in the last season of Avatar: The Last Airbender. So this scene also reminded me a lot of the plot of Thor: The Dark World. A character is infected with some magic, and they go to a desolate world to draw it out and destroy it, and then it all backfires and the villain gets exactly what they want. When Thor lands in the chamber before eternity, we see sculptures of several cosmic entities in the Marvel Comics. There's Eon, a giant eyeball on the side of a floating tree. He created the quantum bands, which might be the bangles in Ms. Marvel. We see a Watcher, much like Uatu and What If. This is Death, the goddess who Thanos worships in the comic books, and this is Infinity. Now, along with Eternity, she is the embodiment of the universe. Eternity is the embodiment of all that is, and Infinity is the embodiment of all that could be. And this is not the first time that Eternity, Death, and Infinity have been statues in the same room. When Peter Quill retrieved the Power Stone in Morag, these cosmic entities, along with Entropy, were seen here reaching for the 6 Infinity Stones. And finally, this is the Living Tribunal, the cosmic judge who is more powerful than Eternity and speaks for the creator of the universe. He was first mentioned here.
This is the staff of the Living Tribunal.
And then was seen here in Multiverse of Madness. And somewhere in there's also a statue of Ereshkigal the Celestial. In fact, maybe these are the original elder gods who have been around as long as existence. If that's the case, then the statue that I said was Death might actually be Chthon, the source of the Scarlet Witch's chaos magic. Then Thor finally raises an army to fight Gorr, except instead of using those selfish gods, he uses the children of Asgard, many of whom are played by the children of the main cast members. Now this was one of my favorite moments in the movie. Thor endows the children with Zeus's power the same way that Odin imbued him with his power.
Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor.
This shows that the only way to raise an army is to literally raise an army, to teach your kids to stand up for what's right. And later we see Valkyrie training the kids to be warriors while she's wearing the jersey of the Asgardian sports team, the Kings. The fight at the end is set to the guitar solo of Guns N' Roses' November Rain, which is appropriate because in the music video, Slash played this solo way outside the church because the church and all that stuff was Axl's idea that Slash hated. So the song itself actually showed the division between these two leaders of the band, just as this scene is about Thor and Jane being apart from each other, and Thor not being able to cope without her help. Jane shows up to fight Gorr, taking the energy of the Necro Sword into Mjolnir, which you could read as a metaphor for the cancer cells that have infected her body. And then they enter the heart of the universe, which looks a lot like a blue Soul World. Soul World being the pocket dimension inside the Soul Stone where Thanos saw Gamora in Infinity War.
What did it cost?
Everything.
Maybe each Infinity Stone has its own pocket dimension, and This is the pocket universe of the Space Stone, since you need a Bifrost to access this realm. Eternity is meditating here, looking exactly like he does in the comics, but he is sitting like Thor was at the beginning of this movie. Much like Thor, he is a god who is waiting on someone to ask him for something. Then Gorr is freed from the influence of the Necro Sword, and Thor convinces him to choose love instead of hate, which is why his daughter was named Love, literally. Jane fades into the force dust of Valhalla, and in the comics, she also goes to Valhalla, but she rejects this afterlife and becomes a badass Valkyrie instead. Afterwards, Thor promised to raise the little girl who, by the way, is played by Chris Hemsworth's real-life daughter, India Rose Hemsworth. So in the final scene, she draws on Mjolnir and keeps it in a little bed like we saw in those Daryl shorts.
Little Mjolnir over here taking a nap.
Those suckers are canon. The movie ends with GNR's Sweet Child of Mine, with Thor's new daughter using her powers of eternity to protect people from monsters. So Thor is raising the next generation to be one of the good gods. Now, actually, Thor did have a daughter in the comics, but we go over all of that and the Hercules post-credits scene in our Ending Explained video, which you really should check out. So the movie does have like nice symmetry. It begins with the death of a child and the death of hope, and it ends with the resurrection of the child and the rebirth of faith in the gods. But is that all the Easter eggs? Did you find any that we missed? Let me know in the comments below, or you can @ me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, be sure to subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For Screen Crush, I'm Ryan Airy.